Don, what is a low carbon fuels policy?
A low carbon fuel policy is a regulatory approach to begin to analyze, understand, and reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we find in our transportation fuels, our gasoline and diesel.
So, how would such an approach work?
Well, the approach is to try to value for the first time the carbon emissions that come from our gasoline and diesel. We need to count them first before we can begin to reduce them. So we start out by figuring out what are the life cycle emissions that are necessary to bring a gallon of gasoline or a gallon of biodiesel or a gallon of ethanol to the market. So in the case of ethanol, we would take a look at the energy used to plant the crop, to harvest a crop, to process it and bring it into a distillery where it's turned into ethanol. In the case of oil, we'd be looking at the energy used to locate the oil, to drill and extract the oil, to transport and refine the oil, as well as the carbon content that is found in that actual gallon of fuel itself. That's the full life cycle. And we need to figure that out because as a planet and as a human species, we have to find ways to reduce the amount of carbon that we're emitting to our atmosphere to control global warming.
So, Minnesota is looking at setting this type of policy. What other states in the U.S. are looking at this?
Well, this type of policy has been recommended by a number of national and regional and local boards and organizations. For example, the federal EPA, under the Renewable Fuel Standard, is looking to develop such a policy. There's a consortium of 11 New England states that have announced a few weeks ago that they will be pursuing such a policy. California is already developing a policy under an executive order signed by Arnold Schwarzenegger about 18 months ago. Minnesota is the first state to move through a legislative approach at this point to put such a policy in place. And we're doing it under the auspices of recommendations from the Midwest Governors Association, 5 upper Midwest states, all of them agricultural states, including our governor's been very involved in this. And we have local state boards called the Next Gen Energy Board and the Minnesota Climate Change Advisory Group that have intensively looked at what are the policies and approaches we need to control carbon emissions in Minnesota to fulfill our own state laws, which call for a reduction in carbon emissions in Minnesota by 80% by 2050. So we're working under our own state laws and our own impetus to try to put forward really a model version of how we might do this.
So, how could such a policy affect air quality and protect the environment?
Well, there's a number of ways. Ethanol, for example, which is a lower carbon fuel, and one way that we could begin to use more of it or blend more of it, that's one way we can reduce the carbon in our fuel. Ethanol itself has been recognized to have health benefits at the ground level in terms of reduced particulates and reduced ozone, which are harmful to humans. So even the 10% ethanol that we're blending into our gasoline today has measurable health benefits. And for that reason, the American Lung Association, for example, has been very outspoken in support of biofuels. There's other environmental benefits that can be done. Some of the types of biofuels that we're looking at, not today's biofuels, but the ones that are just around the corner. Things like a biodiesel that may come from algae grown in wastewater tanks, or things like ethanol that can be made from cellulose or native grasses or woody plants that may be growing on healing land that has been in agricultural production for years, but instead can be put into long-lived perennial plants that can hold the soil, sequester carbon in their roots, and produce an annual crop of biomass that can be used for ethanol. This is the promise of environmental improvement in our waters, in our airs, in our lands. These are the direction that we'd like to move.
What kind of effect could this have on the rural economy, both in Minnesota or in the upper Midwest that this type of policy was in place?
Well, we think this type of policy, frankly, is a policy stimulus for the renewable fuels industry, and not just the existing renewable fuels industry, but it will actually stimulate and reward investment in the lower impact renewable fuels that are just around the corner, as we were just discussing. The reason is there will be a market that will ask not only what is the performance characteristic of your fuel and what is the price, it will also say one of those performance characteristics will be your carbon content, your carbon impact. And some of our ethanol plants have already begun to move into more advanced biofuels. They've installed wind power. They've reduced their energy consumption. They've put biodigesters in to handle some of their wastewater, or they've put in gasifiers to use biomass to make a synthetic gas to run their plants and equipment in displacing fossil fuels like natural gas. Some of these innovations are happening already. We think this kind of policy will create a demand for ethanol coming from those advanced plants and help move us along that technology curve, creating new jobs as the plants are rebuilt, retrofitted, and producing a greener fuel.
How does this fit within national efforts to set, as you said, a low carbon fuels policy, and even international climate change discussions upcoming in Copenhagen?
Those are two huge questions. I'll take them one at a time. Nationally, there's a broad model out there that California has put forward because they're further down the curve with their executive order, and they've taken a very harsh view of biofuels. Effectively, biofuels will not be part of California's low-carbon fuel approach. They're betting on the electric car or plug-in hybrids, which we think is a good option and could be one of many avenues. We do think, though, to solve climate emission problems, we're going to need multiple strategies. So the fact that they are excluding a major strategy to help achieve climate reduction, we think is a mistake. So we've been working here in the Midwest to develop one that provides a stimulus for improving the environmental efficiency of our existing biofuels industry, get some of our land, which is it's being plowed annually to produce corn or soybeans or other crops, get some of that land into a perennial cover. And we believe that that perennial cover will reduce the environmental impacts of farming and provide an income to farmers. And we think we need to work with the advantage that locally homegrown fuels provide, rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that the existing industry is not where we want it to be in terms of sustainability.
What about the international discussion?
The United States has had a credibility issue on climate change internationally. We obviously have had an administration up until recently that was practically a climate change denier and certainly was not willing to cooperate with the world in controlling emissions. There's a new page about to be turned. In order for the U.S. to be taken seriously and re-earn some credibility on this issue, we must find a way to address transportation emissions. Transportation in this country are more than a quarter of our global climate change emissions. We cannot achieve our fair share of emissions without addressing how do we drive down emissions coming from our transportation sector. So whether this exact policy is the key driver, I think the solutions are a group of policies. They include reducing the number of miles that people need to travel to lead their life. That is laying out our communities differently, having work and shopping and food closer to where people live. That includes public transportation as options so that where masses of people are going to popular areas, they have alternative means of getting there that are lower impact overall. That includes making more efficient vehicles so that we get more miles out of each vehicle, each gallon of fuel that's put into it or each unit of energy. But we think it also means improved fuels, one of which can be liquid fuels, some of which can be electric fuels as people are looking at it. We think all of these policies need to move forward to achieve the reductions we're looking for. And I really think the credibility of our country is on the line globally.